There's a whole series we were talking about before on Think on These Things series, and we are in the process of getting them ready for publication. We'll be publishing them and probably do it as a sort of a collection where people get them and then they can give them a slipcase and they can stick them in a slipcase if they want later on. But there's going to be 12 of them as we envision them. You're able to see this? It's working? Okay. And they're going to be looking like this. So you've seen these first three, the Think on These Things, they've been out, but we're going to modify the cover because living with an eternal perspective, as opposed to this one here, you see, this is, I can't even see that it's living with an eternal perspective until I get to that. Oh, there it is down there in the bottom. But here, we're changing the formatting and making it like that. So it's a little bit more obvious what it is. We're going to be looking at these, and there's going to be 12 of them, and we're going to do one a week. And it's my way of kind of giving you an overview of each of these resources because they're all standalone, very short little booklets, about 30 pages or so. And so I want to zoom in then on this first one on living with an eternal perspective. And so we'll be having these available. And we do have some of these, as I said already, in the first three, but we're going to be reprinting them. So let's take a look at this together and process what material we need to have for our own spiritual journey. And it starts off with having fought the good fight and finished the course and keeping the faith, because so many people drop out, and it's discouragement, and they lose heart and grow weary in the journey. So you want to stay really young in the faith. You don't want to get weary, tired, and benched. So many people put themselves in the sidelines. They put themselves in the bleachers and watch the game from the stands rather than are players anymore. That's never meant to be. In fact, no matter how old we are, how enervated we may become, because in a one depressing, cynical way, you could compare life to a conveyor belt that's moving imperceptibly, slowly, like time itself. I mean, imagine a motion image of you looking at yourself in the mirror, and it's all time-lapse photography. Not a pretty thing. We're not getting better looking. So it's this conveyor belt, and a cynic might say that's or a conveyor belt, and it's atrophy and growing, increasing stenosis and desiccation. You become like mummies, and you go out here. It's a depressing thought, if that's where all it was. And to be perfectly frank with you, if I didn't have an eternal perspective that talks about ultimate reality as being a person who loves me, you see, not just a force, but a person, tri-personal being who is the lover of my soul. But he's got to be infinite and personal to do that. If I didn't have that, my whole life and yours too would just be a terrible, bad joke. You'd just be a blip in existence, an episode between two oblivions. But you're more than that. And as Ecclesiastes 3:11 tells us, God set eternity in your heart. You can't get, and there's something in us that's God haunted. Even the atheist can't get rid of that. They don't want to think about it. I was talking with a friend who was doing an interview with a contra-theist, which is interesting. Not an atheist. This guy's a contra-theist. His whole ambition is to destroy theism. But when you go and ask what's the basis for it, what do you value, what do you look for, he won't answer it because he's smart enough to know that as soon as you talk about valuing something or living for something, you have to have a nexus, a basis for it. And if he's so angered about the Holocaust or anything that is associated perhaps with theism, he realizes if you press him not very far, he doesn't have a clue if you said, what's your basis for morality? Why are you so angry? There's no base. What one good or the other? The lex talionis. So it's amazing how people don't think clearly. But he's God haunted, and he's almost inspired to hate this thing because methinks thou dost protest too much. I think the guy is actually a seeker, and he's God haunted because he can't stop asking the fundamental questions of life. And it relates to these 4 questions, and this relates to what we're talking about here. Meaning, identity, purpose, and hope. And those are the 4 questions that I relate to in morning affirmations, as you'll be seeing. I'll tell you more about that as we go to it, so we'll go back to that again. But picking up where we left off before, if I can find the right one, top left. Yeah, there we are. C.S. Lewis put it beautifully. If we find ourselves with a desire that nothing in this world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that we were made for another world. Do you see that? And that's what this guy's haunted by. He knows this can't be all there is. There's got to be more. But if you start asking tough questions and you realize you don't have the answers. I remember in college, I was haunted once when my whole weekend fell apart and I was all by myself for the first time. And I was in the fraternity house and suddenly I began to ask questions I didn't want to ask because I knew I didn't have answers. Where did I come from? Who am I? Why am I here? Where am I going? God, it terrified me. And I said, I'll never let that happen again. I'll distract myself more efficiently and effectively to make sure I never have to think about it. And indeed, most men you know are capable of distracting themselves, even for decades in some cases, by not having to ask those questions that they're the most obvious questions one has to ask. But it's astonishing that the only time they wrestle with them may be at the memento mori called a funeral. Then they have no choice but to realize the window's been open and I'm exposed. And the chill of death is right before me and I lost a loved one. You see, that's this one. And then we try to get it back again. But you see, we're haunted. The most probable explanation is that we were meant for another world. So we're strangers on this planet and we're called to walk in a manner worthy of our calling. And so only God can give us this eternal perspective by the power of the Holy Spirit. And so what we have to do is some of these truths that we have in this booklet are just aids to helping you to remind yourself, reset yourself, recalibrate your mind so that you are thinking about the eternal in the midst of the temporal, to remind you throughout your life, wherever you are in your life, of who and whose you are. It comes down to that issue of who and whose you are. So it starts with the morning affirmations. And some of you have these on a laminated card, a 2-sided thing. This is another form for that. I also put them in Handbook to Prayer. I've got them in a lot of places. I think if a little is good, more is better, and too much is just right. So I'm going to try to let things do double, triple, even quadruple duty. So I like the morning affirmations. I do not use them every morning because it would become too much of a burden on me to go through them every time. But from time to time, it's a very powerful thing for me to go through. And sometimes you can just go through them in a slow manner without feeling you have to go through the whole thing, but maybe a part of it. But it always starts with these answers to the questions of where did I come from? Who is God then? And who am I? And why am I here? And where am I going? Going back to those 4 fundamental questions. We've talked about this before, but I'm just reminding you that you've got to ask this question because if you don't come from infinity and eternity, if that's not in the scope of things, you're just don't have an answer to that. You have no real basis for meaning and purpose in this world. And then the who am I is the question, who are you really? And that's why we have these identity affirmations, which I hope you're using as well. And they're another way of approaching asking the word to define you rather than the world to define you. Remember how I've put this before? The world will define you how? I see that one. We all remember that. It'll define you by default. That's to say, do not do anything, and it'll tell you what you're supposed to believe and what you're going to be defined by people or positions or power or performance, popularity, all those things. But the word will only define you how? If the world will define you by default, do nothing. The word will only define you how? By discipline. You're not going to wake up and suddenly you're spiritual. It requires a long obedience in the same direction, a process of obedience where you show up even when you don't feel like showing up. That's where the discipline comes in. It's not when you feel like doing it, but rather it's to show up with an open heart, an open Bible, and an open perspective where you're allowing, Lord, show me again, remind me of who and whose I am, because it's so critical. Because if the Word defines you, then suddenly you can choose to see who you are as God defines you. Remember how I define that as loving yourself correctly? Is to believe that what God tells about you is true, in spite of your feelings and experiences to the contrary. Nevertheless, this is who you are. So you have to listen to that voice rather than parents, peers, societies, all the lies we picked up. You'll never amount to anything. How come you can't be like your brother? What do you get the B for? And so the performance-based acceptance that's so characteristic of our time and our growth, many of us, who never perhaps heard that I'm pleased with you, you're my beloved son, never heard the blessing. But you see, God gives us a blessing, and we can be reparented by His Word in that respect. Who am I? Identity. Third one, why am I here? The question of purpose. We have to wrestle with purpose. And I believe you have an unchanging reason for being. Even if your career is over, you still have a calling. Your vocation is still there, a calling from God. And fourth, where am I going? And more, I'm living with a mind set toward heaven and toward eternity. And I'm treasuring my the imagination, trying to find ways in which I can create a sense of greater connection, of longing for more than God's that God's provided. So going back to the morning affirmations, then it starts off with submitting to God, not a bad way to begin, and then adoration and thanksgiving. So it's where you came from. You're going back. You're going to Him. And then who am I? And so also, the more you think about who God is, the bigger your vision of God, the bigger your awareness of sin. And then confession or examination follows. And so ask the Spirit to search your heart and reveal any areas of unconfessed sin. Acknowledge these to the Lord and thank Him for His forgiveness. Then your identity in Christ. You remember these 4 F's that we have been granted here by the grace of God. You have forgiveness from the penalty of sin because Christ died for you. You have freedom from the power of sin because you died with Him. You have fulfillment for this day because He lives in you. And you, by faith, you're going to allow Him to manifest His life through you, as you. That's the beauty. Every one of us, as I put it, has a spirit signature, a unique way in which you display the glory of God in a way that no one else ever can, in a unique manner. And thereby, we also have a unique flesh signature in which we can distort that vision in a unique way that no one else can. But here, we have got all the resources we need, forgiveness, freedom, fulfillment, and faith, for us to walk in the power of the Spirit, which brings us to the filling of the Spirit, wanting to be filled with the Spirit. And so, as I do this, trust the Father, abide in the Son, walk in the Son, I walk by the Spirit, I think about the idea of walking by the Spirit. What's that role? Keep in step. Don't go ahead. Don't lag behind. Listen with a voice and the Spirit becomes more real in your life when you become conscious of Him. And when you invite Him and invoke Him as you're speaking to someone or whatever, to do that. So we try to remember this, even when you're about to have a meeting, you're going to trust the Father, abide in the Son, walk by the Spirit. So then the fruit of the Spirit, which is, of course, the qualities that when you see that in a person, love, joy, peace, and so forth, that's a person you want to be around. If I see someone like that, someone who's so other-centered that instead of them doing all the talking, they're trying to pull things out of you. They're interested, they're listening. You see, there's a quality about them that's admirable. And then the nature of love itself, the purpose of your life. So you can see it goes from the identity and now purpose, and then your future, circumstances of this day, protection in the warfare. So you, against the flesh, you reckon yourselves to be dead to sin, and against the evil. The devil, rather, you resist. And so, reckon, renew, and resist. Here's then the questions of who God says I am. So we have this list of things, of identity affirmation. You all have that card, and I don't know if we have any more of those cards or not. We may have to get some more. They're laminated, and they're on one side because the back side is blank because that's not who you are. Think of it that way. Yeah. But you've been accepted. It's just rich and good to review these realities. This is who you are. I mean, to think about yourself as, of course, being a child of God, the most fundamental statement you can make in that respect. And going from there, you're part of that eternal family. And just you could randomly go through this list. And it's interesting when you go through this list, and I invite you to do this regularly, to see which ones do you relate to and resonate with, which ones do you resist. So you might, for example, feel that I don't feel chosen, holy, and blameless. You may not feel so holy and blameless. But does he ask you to feel that way? He asks you to choose to believe that what he says about you is true, in spite of your feelings and experiences in the contrary. Because we all have emotional filters. We all have theological filters. We all have cultural filters. Well, that may be true of him, but it can't be true of me. So you have to invite the Spirit to make it real in your life. And that these are powerful affirmations that give you the security, significance, and satisfaction that you need in order to be other-centered rather than egocentric. And so there's a quality about you when you approach relationships out of the overflow of Christ in you, where it's a sufficiency, not a deficiency mindset. So when you go out of the overflow, you're not trying to milk or manipulate a response. And even if you are not accepted by a person, if there's a rejection, it would be painful, but it doesn't destroy you because you're not defined by their opinions and expectations, but by the one who is the lover of your soul, who wooed you, pursued you, purchased you, provides for you, protects you. That's the lover of your soul. So this is the nature of these wonderful affirmations. God loves you and has chosen you. That's pretty definitive, wouldn't you agree? And if God had a refrigerator, you'd be on it. You see, if he had a billfold, your picture would be, look at my kid, you see, if he had a billfold. Remember those billfold? So it's the idea of you belong in that what has, I remember, called a forever family. It's a kind of an ongoing thing. Then at the end, there are 3 collections of renewal verses that in teaching this, I was reminded I need to go through these again myself, because there are 3 collections. They're not bad to review. I broke them into 3. It would be too much to try to swallow in one. Okay? So it's not a bad exercise. Try this out by going through, in this case, it's from Matthew and following Matthew. Love the Lord your God with all your heart. My command you to love one another. If you love me, you'll keep my commandments. Love is patience. You're getting the idea this is about love. But then without being anxious and so forth, and then perspective of momentary light affliction, eternal weight of glory. And so then there's a second collection, and it takes it from another angle. And but then we have trust in the Lord with all your heart and other wonderful texts of this nature. And that's again just a few pages. And then the third collection is the same. And so clothe yourselves with humility toward one another and so forth. So they're very short, but it's very evident that you can review those things with great profit without having to do Bible roulette. What's a nice verse to follow? So this gives you 3 collections that are profitable. And my recommendation in any of these collections, let me just go back to the first one that we were looking at here. Imagine that you just took some contemplative music or something that resonates with your soul, and then slowly read these as you're hearing that music. That'll enrich the experience. Give it a try. I think we've given you my list, 3 of my music lists, haven't we, Dennis? We've done that before. And I find it to be very powerful and would invite you to consider doing these renewal verses. It's not a bad collection. First collection, you could go through that in one session with some contemplative music. So 3 sessions with that. You see what I'm saying? So that's be a nice assignment for you to try that out, these renewal verses. But at any rate, allow him to put that more in you. The truths are there, but you need to resonate with it. Deep calls to deep. The very one who inspired that word and those truths also lives in you. So the Spirit who inspired it is also the one who can illuminate and apply it. You see, and he does all those wonderful things. By the way, we're adding 2 new cards, some cards to the spiritual renewal cards, and one of them is going to be this little collection here. Let me see. Remember these? What do you seek? That'll be the first one. I figured that'd be good to have. And the other one is remember what you seek, and then it's the other one is trust the Father, abide in the Son, walk by the Spirit. What do you say today? I got to thinking about these 3, by the way, and realized they reminded me of another prayer, the prayer of St. Richard of Chichester, that may we know you more clearly, love you more dearly, and follow you more nearly. So I just threw that in yesterday. So I think it's true, because you see, what do I seek? I seek to know him, the author of life and light and love. If I know him, I've got all things. And who do you say I am? Who is you know how you come to love Jesus more? By not trying to love him more, but by learning about the way he loved you. You see, and just reviewing who he is, and that I may love you. So to know him is to love him, and to love him is to be willing to obey him. And that relates to the third question, do you love me more than these? Because you see, you got to make a choice between one master or another master in every circumstance of life. Every day is full of choices. Who am I going to follow this day? Am I going to follow the crowd? Am I going to follow the pulls of this world? Or am I going to follow the prompts of the living God who loves me? So obeying him. Do you love him more than these means I'll brook no rivals, and you must choose me more than others. And then I have the what? So then after that, I have the trust the Father, abide in the Son, walk by the Spirit. And so I'm putting that into a card there as well. Another card we're going to be adding, I should mention, by the way, is going to be the 12 ministries of the Holy Spirit. They're in 2 pages and conform to his image. And I began to realize that that's a pretty powerful way for me to really get to know the Spirit of God, who, as Alistair McGrath puts it, the Holy Spirit is the Cinderella of the Trinity. The other sisters got invited to the theological ball, but she was left out every time. Why is that? Seems remote. In fact, most people wrongly call the Holy Spirit an it. It's not an it. He's a he. He's a person. And you must realize that there's a sequence, and there's a beautiful sequence when it goes from convicting and all these components of indwelling and empowering and so filling, that really are gifts that you've been given. There are 12 of them, nice number. And the idea of just reviewing those can be very powerful, because it'll make him more real in your life and more attuned. So you can start to invoke the power of the Spirit of God in your life journey. So that's where we are, and we're going to have a little session together. So I think it would be rather good for us to consider this little thing that I've just given you here. That would be a thing for us to discuss. And how do we know him more clearly? Relating to, what do you want? And if you want infinity and eternity, and you were meant for that, he's the only one who'll provide it. And Jesus puts a face to that infinity and eternity. And when you see that face, that the infinite word became the incarnate word, well, how do you come to, who is he to you, as he is the centrality of your life? And then you begin, and that relates to loving him, I think. It relates to, who do you love? What do you seek? Who do you love? Who you're going to obey? So it comes down to following him more nearly. Chew on that for a few minutes together. So with my group, I created a little chart. Let's just put this. Oh yeah. So this is what you were looking at. And in my group, I made this little chart here, the idea of that there's a reunion, that there's a cycle. To know him is to love him, is to follow him, but that makes you know him better. Because remember, obedience, as I've said before, is the portal of divine disclosure. You want to know him better? Do what I call you to do. Then you'll know me. Take the risk. You have to combine faith with action. And so, and then we were looking at Hebrews chapter 4. Let us fear if, while a promise remains of entering his rest, any one of you may seem to have come short of it. For indeed we had good news preached to us, just as they also, but the word they heard did not profit them, because it was not united by faith in those who heard. How do you unite it by faith? It's in obedience. So that you can, if you look at obedience, then wrong one. With obedience, you're looking at this concept of knowledge, understanding, experience, application. At the end of the day, it's the application that's the one that matters most. It's not what you say or profess. It's what you do. And if you love me, you're going to prove it by your actions. But application seems to be short in supply. And so many people give more of a lip service, but they don't really apply it, you see. So this is why to hear, and the Hebrew mindset of what it means to hear is to obey, you see. Otherwise, they have ears to hear, but they do not hear, eyes to see, but they do not see. So it must be combined by faith, and it manifests itself in action. So that the fruit of faith, if the faith is alive, as James 2 tells us, it's going to produce something, some fruit that's born. So going to this idea, then, when I was chewing on this idea of these three, I think that this is how I see it: that to know him and to love him and to follow him means that I'm going to know him, love him, and follow him. There's a reunite. Does that make sense to you, that idea? It's a thought, but I think that they do mutually enhance one another and feed each other. What experiences? We have the mic and all that. Yeah, thank you.
I don't think any of us are going to disagree with you, but my question would
be... You may very, very well. You may disagree.
How do you define, or can you explain obedience versus works?
It is a work of faith. So I think, but not work salvation, work as the evidence of and manifestation of the application. So that if you combine works are obedience. In other words, that you bear fruit in every good work, increasing in the knowledge of God, so that, this is why Paul is praying that you be filled with the knowledge of his will and all spiritual wisdom and understanding, so you'd walk in a manner worthy of the Lord, to please him in all respects. So you want to please him. Bearing fruit in every good work is the outcome of that. And then what the outcome of that is, and increasing in the knowledge of God. You see, so that there's a reciprocal relationship. We're not talking about works salvation. We're talking about works as a result of a saving faith. And that is going to be, and in fact, one can be very right in questioning, if there's no manifestation, no evidence of change in your life, then you'd be well invited to say, test your faith to see if it's real, as Paul invites the Corinthians to do, to see. But it's going to be united with obedience. And what obedience is a palpable expression of trust. The way you want to prove that you trust me, do what I call you to do. And that brings us to the John 14 concept that we've seen before. If you love me, what will you do? Here's how you're going to express it in action. Keep his commandments. And then verse 21 and 23 make it very clear that, as I put it, obedience is the portal of divine disclosure. So you want to know him better, do what he calls you to do, which brings me back to this little chart that I had here. I got to make it look better than that, but that's the idea. I like the idea of a fluidity, a movement, a progress, don't you? The idea that each one, so it's not something static, but dynamic. And in fact, you could almost say that there's a kind of another way of seeing it here. I'll just add a little thing here so I can draw on it. Yeah. So it's almost like this. If I'm going to draw this little chart here, As you go through this process of knowing, loving, and obeying him, there's a kind of reciprocal process where it goes more and more. It continues on, you see, like this. But there's a sense in which perhaps we could say that the whole thing actually feeds and grows in another way, so that it becomes a small process here that after a while gets amplified and larger, you see, like that. So you're not going in a circle. It's a upward ascending spiral. That would make sense, wouldn't it? So each time you go through it in a certain way, you're spiraling upwards. You're not going in a circle, you see, running around and around like the hamsters in a cage, and they're running fast, and there's a cat by the cage, and one of them says to the other one, "Run faster, he's still there." But you're running in the cage. You're going nowhere, you see. I don't care how fast you go. It's not going to get you anywhere. Making good time, you got off where you started and you haven't been anywhere when it goes to the merry-go-round. So the idea, though, I see it as a kind of a growth of intimacy, because every time you go through this cycle, it seems to me that it should very imperceptibly enhance the next. Would that make sense to you? I'm thinking out loud here with you. But it makes sense to me. Yeah, I like that. All right. Yes, a question there. Yes, do you have the mic? Oh, yeah.
Yes, I do. One thing is that Pastor Jeff is starting a series this coming Sunday on Satan. And so thought came to mind while you were going through this morning is from Screwtape Letters. Uncle Screwtape told his nephew Wormwood that whatever you do, don't let your patient think about the things that you're talking about here this morning. He said, you got to keep him out of that.
Keep him distracted.
Keep him in the present. Got to keep him distracted.
Yeah, that's right. You have to, indifference and distraction are the two major vehicles by which people try to avoid the claims of God in their lives. And they were both predicted 3 centuries ago by Pascal, that the two things men will do is indifference and distraction. And boy, we have industries of distraction that keep us away. It's a frightening world, you see, when all of a sudden in 2007, everything changed in that year, and not entirely for the good. It's a mixed blessing, but more downward than upwards in my view. And the net of the whole is that relationships are less authentic, connections are less real, and so forth. Loneliness only increases as a result of the isolation, digital isolation, as it were. There was another question. We're out of time. I just realized I'm looking at my I'm looking at my smartphone here. Oh yes, I must obey.